Our author tonight is Jacquelyn Mitchard. She is an accomplished author. I'm actually a little cowering around her because of the things that she has accomplished literarily. She's here tonight to talk to us about her most recent book, To If By Sea. And this is a story that is about a retired police officer who survives a terrible disaster and gets matched up with sort of a pivotal character that will be very important to his life. And I know she's going to tell you more about that, but the writing is beautiful and moving and touching. Many of you will know our guest from an earlier book that she wrote, which was selected for a book club. There's some TV host who had a book club. What is her? Oprah something, Oprah Winfrey, I think was her name. And she had a book club back in the late 90s that she started. And the first book that she ever chose for her book club was Jacquelyn Mitchard's book, The Deep End of the Ocean. And we are so happy to have her here tonight. Delighted that she is here. She's a native of Chicago, studied creative writing at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She has written over 20 books for both adult and young people audiences. And her most recent book is just a vivid, it's like I keep reading reviews of it and they talk about how beautiful it is, and it is, but if you haven't read it, it just has these emotional, gripping, fabulous passages of just great emotional depth. And so I'm very excited to hear her talk about it. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to tonight's guest for the Craig Buteau Author Series, Jacquelyn Mitchard.
Don't be afraid by seeing this book. I'm an MFA teacher, and I know how it is when people, even people you love and whose work you admire, get up in front of you and say, I'm going to read from a few short sections of this book, and then you think, what kind of illness can I fake to get out of the room quickly enough so that even, there's no more excruciating experience than being read to if you're over the age of 8. So I'm not going to read, I'm going to read 3/4 of a page from this book, but only after I talk about a couple of other things. And I decided tonight that I would, I have, like all authors are indebted to libraries. All authors have an extraordinary attachment to libraries as an institution. And tonight, the people who aren't here are listening to two presidential candidates debating about the future of our country, and each of them hoping that their story is the story that, whether we believe it to be true or not, we believe it. We believe that they're the one, that person is the one who's going to lead us toward a future of prosperity and some kind of hope. And the libraries function extraordinarily, not in just the maintenance of our intellectual lives, but in the maintenance of our culture altogether. What's the first thing that people do when they want to destroy a nation's culture? They destroy the books. That's right. They destroy the things that people depend on for their solace, that people depend on to teach their children, because stories of all kinds are what we use to teach not just the ways of civilization, but morality and ethics. And I know that when I have a great many children, only 9 when I left home. I hope that nothing has proliferated since I left 19 days ago, but like grandchildren, hope that hasn't happened. When I talk to my children and say to them, there's a point that I want to make to you, an instruction I want to give you that will better you. This is what they hear. And so, but when I say to them, I grew up in Chicago with a guy named Tony. He always stood like this, so we called him 10 to 6. And he was always getting in trouble. But the most important thing his mother ever told him, then they're hooked. They're hooked because they have a story. And my children have used, we live on Cape Cod where there are only little libraries. The one in our town is called the Brewster Ladies Library because Brewster Ladies started that library a very long time ago. And if you have a library, you have not only a repository of knowledge, you have a place where even if you have newspapers in your shoes, you can go and read the newspaper with dignity. And it's a place where any kind of person, if the person can behave well enough, is welcome to go and read and be out of the rain and to learn about the sort of the story of human beings, which is all books are, the story of what it means to be a human being, whether they're history or whether they're biology or whether they're fiction. I didn't study writing at the University of Illinois where I went to college. I studied biology. I thought I would be a doctor. But then I came to the math part, and I realized that telling stories about science, telling stories that involved the other parts of the natural world was more something that I was going to do. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories tonight. One of them is funny, one of them is scary, and one of them is sad but meaningful, but they're all about stories. They're all about things that stories mean to us in our lives. And the first, I'm going to tell you the scary one first. I don't know if it's scary or creepy. To me, it was both. I started this tour in Portland, Oregon. This was maybe 6 weeks ago. I went out there to teach some master classes to people who were writers, and on the second day of the master class, I was sitting with my students. We were about to break for lunch, and a guy came in to the classroom, and he was dressed to the nines. He had on a nice black overcoat and a fedora, and I looked at him, and I knew this guy from someplace. It was like seeing your priest at the swimming pool. You knew the person, but not in that context, and not in those clothes. So it was very disorienting. And he said, "It's Michael, hi." That didn't narrow it down. And I sat there and thought, who is this fellow? And then I remembered. He hugged me, and I remembered that years ago, I had been in an airport in Idaho, and I'd met a guy who worked for the airport, not an airline, and the wheels had fallen off my suitcase because I needed a new one, and I had been around too long, and he helped me get the suitcase onto the plane and go back to the place where I lived then, the place near Boston where I lived. And he had decided, I sent him some books of mine at that time. He had read some of them. I sent him some other ones, and we had corresponded a little back and forth. And he thought because of that we were good friends, or maybe even more than that. And because the stories, you know the way that you feel when you read a story that is personally meaningful to you, you feel as though it's been written just for you. You feel as though that writer somehow understands your heart, and you find yourself saying things like, you wrote down exactly what I feel, but I could never put it into words. Well, that's how he felt. And he said, my intern, Stephanie, was there, and he said, "Could I take you guys out to dinner later?" And I said, and Stephanie was behind me saying, "No, he's creepy." And I, of course, wanted to be nice and fair, as many people do who later end up with captions under their names that say Mitchard was found in the trunk of her car. So Stephanie and I went back to the hotel, and the hotelier said to us, "Oh, did you see your best friend? He checked into the room next to you. I know he wanted it to be a surprise." It was. And I thought, of course, of that young woman who was a news reporter and what happened to her. And I thought, well, you know, if he drills a hole in the wall and looks through it, serves him right. And I didn't worry that much about that anymore. But we went out to a restaurant. No one knew where we were going. And he showed up there. And he sat down at the table and he said, "Just go on eating. Don't let me interrupt you," like we could ever eat again. And so we boxed up the food. We got in a cab. He got in a cab. He followed us back. And so by then I was feeling nervous. And I called a buddy, or I wrote to a buddy of mine, a very good friend of mine, who maybe is the foremost expert in security for the whole world, certainly for the United States. His name is Gavin DeBecker. And he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear, which whether you're a guy or whether you're a woman, you should read this book. It's profound. It's about the way that human beings feel about their instincts. It's called The Gift of Fear. And in it, he makes the case, through stories, that your instincts are not right 90 or 95% of the time, but 100% of the time. If you feel that something is wrong, it is wrong. If you feel that a person is a wrong guy, that person is a wrong guy, even if the person doesn't ever do anything. So no one knows where Gavin DeBecker lives. I know this because I saw this on the show Entourage. I know where Gavin lives, but he's very on background. He's someone who's very concealed in his personal life. The movie The Bodyguard was based on a part of Gavin's life when he was in love with a very famous African-American woman, movie star. He does not look like Kevin Costner then, or he looks a little more like Kevin Costner now, but he certainly didn't then. But something like 1,500 bodyguards work for him. They guard the Supreme Court, they guard senators, and lots of movie stars. He's a very dangerous guy in some essential ways. So where he lives now, he had heard from me years ago because I went around telling people, read this book, read this book. One day I got an email from him, and he said, "You know, I really like what you're saying about my book. If you're ever in Fiji, why don't you come and visit me? And, you know, bring your family." And I said, "Okay, I'll be there in May." And I don't think he expected that, but I did go, and he had a big place with bunches of houses, and I stayed for 3 weeks, and we really became great pals. He doesn't live there anymore, but where he does live, at that place it was 3 o'clock in the morning. But still he answered me right away. He called me on the phone. He said, "Something's scaring you. What's going on?" He said, "You got to go next door and you got to give that guy an unequivocal refusal. You have to say to him, you have to reject him. You have to say, we're not friends. We can't have any kind of relationship. I want you to know this, and I want you to know that you're scaring me and you need to leave me alone, period." And I said, "What'll happen?" He said, "Well, either he'll escalate or he'll leave you alone." And I said, "So if he escalates and he sets me on fire, then you'll read about that, and my book will sell really well, but this is the last conversation that we're ever going to have." And he said, "He's not going to do that. He's a planful kind of guy from what you said. That's not what he's going to, that's not the way he'll do that." And so I did. I went, "Next door. Michael," he opened the door. Stephanie's standing behind me. I said, "I'm not your friend, and we can't have any kind of relationship, and I need you to leave me alone." Shuts the door. I go back in my room. We go to the next town. He's there too. So then, Gavin said, "Well, he hasn't done anything illegal, so maybe I will have someone talk to him." And later on, we learned that there was a guy who came who was like all the Marines in the world put together and smushed into one big guy who came and had a quiet chat with this fellow, and he went away. But that's how stories can work, even in the minds of people who aren't that okay. Because I've had, and so have many other writers whose books have been read by many people, that people stalk them. They believe that they're friends. They believe that they come up to you and say, "I'm Marie, I wrote you an email." It was in 2004. And they believe that they have a relationship with you, which is exactly what you want as a writer, except when it isn't. Okay, the second story is funny, and the gent who introduced me started to explain it. You know, in the late 90s, I wrote a book called The Deep End of the Ocean, and there were answering machine tapes at that time. They didn't have digital answering machines. I went down in my little office in Madison, Wisconsin, and there was a message on the answering machine, just one. And it said, "This is Oprah Winfrey, and I have loved The Deep End of the Ocean more than any book I've read in the last 10 years. It spoke to me in so many different kinds of ways." And on she went to the end of the tape, and I erased that because I thought it was someone horsing around with me. And so the next morning, there was another message. It said, "This is Oprah Winfrey, and I don't know if you got my message, but I have loved The Deep End of the Ocean so much I can't have it on the show because we don't feature fiction on our show. But I just want to tell you, I've known so many families who have been in despair, and this really expressed a beep, you know," and I erased that too. And on the third day, my then intern, Sean, said, "Jack, I think that really is Oprah Winfrey, and now she's pretty mad." And so I pressed the button, and she said, "This is Oprah Winfrey, and I don't know if you even live here or if you're just the rudest person in the world, but if you're not, could you at least do me the courtesy of returning my phone call?" So I did, laughing. I was laughing like you're laughing now. And she started to laugh, and she said, "You know, I can't have your book on the show because books and TV are antithetical, and the ratings will just go right down. We've tried it before." And I said, "Okay." And the next day, she called back and she said, "We're going to start the world's largest book club. And we're going to start it with this book. And my publisher said to me, at least if there's never a second Oprah Winfrey book, you'll always have been the first, Jackie." But instead, by that night, there were 4,000 holds on that book at the New York Public Library alone. Because books and TV aren't really antithetical. Books and TV, or books and anything aren't antithetical. Books are meant to be gossiped about. And that's what the Oprah Winfrey Book Club did, was say, let's gossip about this as a country. Let's talk about this book and all the things that it meant to us and who those people might really be based on, and so on. So that was a great deal of fun. About a year ago, it's another message on my now digital answering machine from Oprah Winfrey's producer, and she said, "We heard you had some trouble." We did have some trouble. An investment advisor stole all our money. And I heard that you finally got it together and decided to write another novel, and we heard it's pretty good. Do you want to come on the show? So I called back. My mother-in-law was there. She's a very protective person of me, but also protective of the fact that it was my husband who made the investment choices. And she said, "You can't do that. Where are they now?" It's like, look at the name of that. It's like, are they still alive? You know, they'll think you're some kind of old has-been. And they'll think you're like David Cassidy or something, and you put all that money just up your nose. So, and you're just making up a big story. And so I said, "Oh, okay, I won't come on." And I held strong to that decision until just about a month before 2 Up by Sea was to be published. They called back again and said, "You know, we mean you no harm. We're sad about what happened to you, and because you worked so hard. And also, this is a good book. And you have nothing to be ashamed of any more than if someone stole your purse and mugged you in Central Park. And my mother-in-law wasn't there. And I had a new purple outfit that was really pretty. So I said, okay, I'm going to go. And I went out there, and I said before I hung, I said, I have to be able to bring my teenage daughters. That's a deal breaker. They said, fine. So my 2 teenage daughters, Merritt and Mia, went with me, and they horsed around and got their picture taken with Oprah Winfrey. And now everyone stands when they walk through the neighborhood because they are personal friends of Oprah Winfrey, which is, it's the only time they've ever respected my work in their lives and been thrilled by it. And it did turn out to be a good interview, and it did turn out that people were extraordinarily compassionate. And again, the power of a story had an enormous effect that went on for a long time. And even if it was a personal story and one that's not fiction, though I dearly wish that it was, that went on and affected other people in a way that was not unbeneficial, because there's an extraordinary amount of shame that's connected with being hoodwinked to that degree. And I think people felt better when they saw that show. And this is the third story, the one that's sad. And maybe this story is the most moving of all. It's very small. The first copy of To If by Sea I signed. A woman came up to me in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was speaking at a library event, and it was a big event, and the woman was lovely, maybe 10 years younger than I am, beautifully dressed and tall and fit. And she said, just sign your name. I'm going to give this book away after I read it. I'm giving all my books away. And I said, well, are you moving? And she said, in a sense, I'm dying. And my breath left me. And she said, but I only have maybe 2 or 3 months left to live, maybe 4. And that's not a long time to live. But it's certainly time enough to read many stories and to take solace in those stories, as I always have. And I need those stories more than ever, because who knows what waits for me? Maybe it's just a good night's sleep. Maybe it's another story. But for right now, I want to immerse myself in stories more than I ever have before, because they take me out of the reality of what is so difficult, nearly impossible for me to bear. That was truly moving for me, but I thought of my own life, and in times when I've thought, I just can't get up tomorrow morning. And usually I take solace in stories, and stories, books, they always take you in. They're always there for you. They'll always let you into to be that particular magic carpet that takes you to another place outside yourself. And lots of times when you come back in the morning or the next day or over the course of a couple of days, you have found that the solace has spread out to give you some kind of hope. And if it isn't hope that things will get better, it's hope at least that things can be endured. And so I was very moved by that, and very touched by the way that someone, instead of saying her bucket list was books. We're all here in a library tonight. That was her bucket list. I'm going to read all the stories that I can for as long as I can, which I thought was tremendous and tremendously moving. So now that we've run out of other things to talk about, and I forgot, I have 3 of my graduate students here. Hi, it's the Governator. Hi, Meredith. That not just 2, but 3 of my, see what a good teacher I am, from 2 different schools. I'm thrilled by that. Writers who one day will be occupying this place, though they won't have to stand on stools like I do in order to see you. I'm going to talk about To If by Sea, which is the story of a guy who wanted to have an ordinary life. You know how that starts out? You want to have an ordinary life in which not much happens except good things. And he wanted even more than that. He wanted to have an ordinary life that was really boundaried, in which he did what he wanted to do and wasn't really beholden to anyone else. And then he got injured in an accident. This police officer was disabled, and he moved to Australia and worked training horses, even though he doesn't like horses, because that's what his father and grandfather did. And he met a woman, and love took him by surprise, and he got married to this emergency room doctor, and they were expecting a baby, and then the Brisbane tsunami happened. And she's killed in the Brisbane tsunami along with the rest of her family. It happened on Christmas Eve. It almost really did happen on Christmas Eve, but it didn't happen. It could have happened. And so I put it into a populous place, because that's the beauty of fiction, is that you can make up your own universe. And then the next morning, being the kind of guy who would wear the T-shirt that my daughter, Francie, gave me for last Mother's Day, to remind me what I had always told them, which was, be brave and try to be good. And because he wanted to be brave and to try to be good, he went out as a volunteer fireman, and he rescues a little boy from a flooded car. And the little boy is almost 4 years old, and it emerges that he can do something that's impossible by saying that this is the American Sign Language sign for behave, sometimes for be good. And by willing people to do what he wants, Ian can literally cause them to be good and do what he wants. So there are some bad guys in this book, and I will tell you they are really bad guys. Everyone who reads this book says, the villains in this are really bad. They're not messing around. They do things that, there must be something wrong with you. So they're really bad guys, and what they want of this little boy is to have him go into a museum and say, be good, give me that pre-Columbian figure. And they've done that before, and it's only a little kid, so there's nowhere that they can find him, even with the CCTV. But Frank Mercy finds this little boy and intends to just give him to the Red Cross volunteers, but he finds himself doing the only illegal thing that he has ever done in his life, taking him back to his home in Wisconsin from Australia with an illegal passport. He doesn't realize that Ian is pulling the strings and having him do what he wants him to do. That's only the first 20 pages, so I'm not giving anything away. And what I'm going to read to you is literally 3/4 of a page, and then you can ask me any questions that you want to ask. Well, not any, but many questions if you want to ask them, and I will make the answers up. So Frank sprains his wrist in the course of this rescue, and he goes to the doctor at Our Lady Help of Christians, which is the hospital where his wife was the chief of emergency services. The doctor pulled a packet of gum from a drawer and handed it to the little boy, who accepted it with an amazing and trustful grin. "You'll look after Uncle, won't you?" the doctor said. The boy stood and slid the gum packet into the rucksack, which was very small and also pale orange, with a soccer ball decaled on the side in silver, carefully lifting the doctor's outside pen and a prescription pad. He drew a line along which he carefully drew an intersecting arrows facing up and to the right, and then a line underneath it in which he carefully drew intersecting arrows facing to the left. He then held out the finished product, which was no more than an inch long, to the doctor as if this explained everything. What did it mean? Was it some kind of writing? Had that little woman in the van been Japanese? She hadn't been Japanese. This wasn't Japanese writing. When the doctor nodded, the child delicately lifted his two small hands and swung them in a small arc in front of his chest, back, forth, back, describing in the air the same angle as the lines he drew. Frank thought, he's trying to behave? Be good? The child hadn't spoken. Had he spoken? Frank said to the doctor, well, he's shy, now especially. Frank led the little boy down the stairs and out the door. They walked a quarter of a mile down the street to a big makeshift auditorium, a square block of canvas with the Red Cross flag high on a spire, visible even out to the ships at sea. The line was halfway down the street. Frank took out a couple of the Vicodin given him by the doctor and bit down. He had a prescription for more of it, and just where was he supposed to find a working pharmacy? Some wily entrepreneur was selling lemonade and stuffed pita. Frank bought 2 of each, and he and the boy stood in the line, munching on some sort of fried vegetable stuff with yogurt as a sauce. The child had a good appetite. Gradually, the line of the hopeful, dirty, deranged, sleepless, and damned shortened, and in a moment, Frank would be able to present the child to the caretakers where he belonged. Frank would be able to give him up to the people who would look after him. Finally, they came to the front, and a sweating volunteer fixed on them, exhausted but desperately good-natured. And Frank looked down at the child and began to think crazy stuff he hadn't thought since he was writing poems during night school lectures with the goal of toppling girls into the back of his truck. This child was his pulse. He was Frank's. No one else could have him. Nothing could change this. Frank took out his mobile, although it hadn't rung. Of course, he said loudly. Yes, great, we'll be right there. He said to the volunteer, found his dad, all is well. Thanks anyway. Thank you. So, do you want to know things like what kind of mascara Oprah Winfrey really wears? Because
I got goosebumps when I listened to you on the TV talking about this book. I was so excited to come here.
now you're going to say, and now I read it and I really hate it.
And I haven't read it. I got it. I just got it a little while ago. And I was wondering already, without reading it, is there going to be a sequel?
No.
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 Okay.
No, there won't be.
Do you have
I
any-
thought about that, actually, more with this book than, because there's a sequel to The Deep End of the Ocean called No Time to Wave Goodbye. And it also is quite a good book. But when I did that, I thought, you know, it was almost like having my kids move back home. And that's happened to me. You know, we have a revenant in the basement right now. He doesn't realize that we know he's there and just comes up at night and gets food and goes back down. And so generally when I write books that are a freestanding novel and not part of a series, I have an idea for a series, but it wouldn't be the next book or the next book, but the ones after that. I do have an idea, and I would love to write a series character, but these aren't series characters. Now ask me what the difference is, and I'll say, I don't know. I guess that they don't have, they have things resolved, at least in a certain sense, by the end of the book. Though I would be really interested to know what Ian could do with that power if he grew up, when he grew up, and could say, Mr. Palestine, you know, Mr. Israel, you know, be good.
It seems so difficult to get publishers or even agents to read an unsolicited submission. You know, I've gotten so many rejections, and they're not even rejecting the work because they don't like it. They're just saying, you know, I get 50 of these a week. I don't even have time to look at it. So
They're not saying that. If you're querying, they're really not saying that. All that stuff you hear is baloney. Agents want to find the next big thing desperately, and you don't have to know anybody or be anybody in order to get a good agent. You just have to have written something good. And they definitely are going to look at it. If it is a person who is a member in good standing of the AAR, the Association of Author Representatives, they are bound by their covenant with their organization to give everybody due diligence. And they have readers who read the submissions for them, and then pass along the ones that they think have the most merit. There's a structure in place. I used to just say to people, and I still do, go to the library, you happen to already be here, find a book that you admire that you think your book is sort of like, and if the person doesn't hate his agent or her agent by then, they will acknowledge their agent, and you'll write to that agent and say, I read that you represent Ken Follett or Joe Matzeratz, and I admire his story, and I wonder if you are accepting new clients. And if they are, they will tell you so, and many of them are. And even if they aren't, if they like your work, they'll accept it anyway. So all that stuff about, that it's impossible to find an agent and a publisher, it just isn't true. You have to write something good, and then it will be published. I mean, that is just the case. They want to do it. And there's a structure in place now that there wasn't exist before. These writers' conferences. And I can recommend the best ones to you if you want to ask me, at which you go and have 15 minutes of conversation or 10 minutes of conversation with an agent or an editor. I am an editor. I'm a book editor who has a realistic young adult imprint, and I've acquired 4 or 5 books by meeting people at the Writer's Digest conference.
It's the Writer's Digest conference?
Is just top-notch.
Okay.
It's top-notch, it's classy, they do things the right way.
Great. Thank you very much.
So, sorry to break your bubble, but you really have, and I was on a panel the other day with Cynthia Aprix Sweeney, who wrote The Nest. She's 64. It's her first novel. It's a New York number 1 New York Times bestseller. No excuses. Just do it.
Do you have any idea where your book is going to end up when you begin, or do your characters just take you there?
My characters would just sit on the couch and eat Doritos if I didn't get them up and doing something. They would just sit there and say, "Oh, the game's on. Wait." So no, I definitely do know, and in this I am different from every other author. Every other author just sets out, and as Edgar Doctorow famously said, writing a story is like driving across country in the fog. You only need to see as far as the headlights can illuminate, but you can get across the whole country that way. I need to see all the way to Wyoming when I start across the country. I need to know what the end of the book is, and I almost even know the words of it, the ending. And the rest of the book is in some way a way to get to that ending. I don't feel safe otherwise. Most other writers who are pals of mine say that if it's like a mountain, when they're right almost at the summit, then they know what the ending's going to be, and they write toward that then. But I'm very careful with my characters so that they don't get out of control and go off bushwhacking in the tall grass and ruin the whole plot. So I keep them on a short leash, and they don't. And boy, if they really did speak to me, I would be very rich if I was channeling from the universe, or if all these, like Nicholas Sparks says, all those stories were from his family. He must have a really big family. But, it would be, I wish that they would. I wish the universe and my characters would say, Jackie, here's this is a great idea. All you have to do is write it down. But it doesn't work that way for me.
I have an interesting story to tell. I've been a writer, but I've not been a writer of fiction. I'm kind of a natural philosopher, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. I haven't studied philosophy, but I'm conceptual. Metaphors come to me very quickly. But actual concrete stories are very difficult for me to come up with and difficult for me to sustain. The details of the story that make it interesting for a reader feel very dull to me to write out. And I would like to write some sort of memoir, and I have been thinking about writing in fiction, and I have an interesting idea for it, but I've had this idea for probably 10 years and haven't fleshed it out. I wrote about 1.5 pages at one point. So I'm wondering if you have come across this. You've talked to a lot of people and you've written a lot. what someone that isn't a natural storyteller, but is, has other ways of thinking, what type of writing would work, or could I fit that into fiction?
What kind of writing would work is personal essays. What kind, that incorporated very small anecdotes so that you wouldn't have to sustain a long narrative to make a philosophical point. If you look at personal essays many people, there are many wonderful personal essays. Some are more reportage, some are humorous, some are about life topics particular to women or particular to men or travel. But the common factor is that they're boundaried. They're much shorter. You don't have to sustain a long narrative, though you do drop stories into them. They're more a way, the stories are a vehicle for expressing your particular philosophical point. So, and yet they're very creative. They're very creative and entertaining, and people take sustenance from them. I teach creative nonfiction in one of the programs that I teach in, and many of the people are memoirists who are writing, for example, a memoir about growing up not just growing up in a dysfunctional family. That's every memoir is about growing up in a dysfunctional family, because if you grew up in a functional family, you wouldn't have those ego needs, and you would just be living your life and not have to write about it. While they're writing it in a memoir in a series of chapters, each of which is a discrete essay. So that's what I would recommend considering. You're welcome.
I've been asked to just mention that the library will be having a short course. That's a class that meets once a week for 6 weeks for 2 hours, is it, each night, that starts May 12th on how to write a book. So those of you who are interested in developing this craft further.
Is it by someone who's written a book? I'm kidding.
It's a great question, though.
You really got me thinking when you talked about how you see the end from the beginning. So can that really be true? And I'm saying that because it seems to me, just from my experience, that what you're saying is true with caveats, because I could see the whole three-act design, if you want to call it that, without being predictable, and character development, and maybe even how it ends. But don't you experience surprising
of course.
journeys on
You
the part of the-
experience side trips and serendipity,
Yeah.
good and bad,
Yeah.
all along the way. And
Yeah.
things that you think are good that turn out to be just lacuna in the road.
So it's really still an
yes,
adventure.
it is. It's a conceptual map that has a great many potential detours, some of which may enrich the story, some of which may drown the story.
Yeah.
But in a general way, I never write, I don't say, well, I want to write a story about friendship, or I want to write a story about infidelity.
Right.
Or I say, I want to write a story about a woman who, or I want to write a story about a guy who. What would he do? And what am I also interested in that he could do? And what am I interested in that he could do that I could actually write about, because I can't have him be a physicist? And what would he be interested in that I could do that other people would be? So, and gradually I'm starting to make that, the only thing that you can't do if you write a novel is have it be about a woman who's a cake baker, because that's the trope, of novels, that people are bakers or own their own bakery shop now, because it's a thing that everybody can do, and there's just been too many of them. There have been so can't do that.
I'm curious about how you came up with the title for your books. Not this one, but other books as well.
Because you know why this one is this way.
They seem to have a nautical theme.
Well, lots of them do, and I don't know. Oprah Winfrey. That was another thing that she said to me, is that, do you believe that that the ocean and the sea is metaphorical for rebirth? And I said, no. And she said, but it is. And all of those books, like Still Summer, and they all have water in them, and they all have, and this one and the Deep End of the Ocean, and they're redemptive in that way. And that's, I guess, why she's Oprah Winfrey and I'm not. Because she's thinking about things on a bigger scale, and I'm just thinking about, should this guy fall in love with the woman? I guess everything is this book had, I sweated blood over this title. It had titles that were so horrible, I've forgotten them because I had to seal off that part of my memory in which I was really stupid. And then I was in Boston, and I was thinking of, Paul Revere. I was thinking of One If by Land and Two If by Sea. And the next line was actually the line that I was thinking about Frank being there for this little kid, and I on the opposite shore will be. That he would be the protector. And I thought of them meeting in a flood, and they were together. And so it seemed like a really good title for that. And no one ever changes my titles. I'm really happy about that. And my publishers never try to change my titles because I've gone through the agony of thinking of the right one, and generally they're happy. Generally they're happy with them. But I do go through some really, really mutt ones before I get to oh my goodness. And my kid, one of my kids, my third-born son, actually thought up the name The Deep End of the Ocean. He asked me if there was a deep end of the ocean like there is the pool, the 12-foot and the 5-foot, 3-foot. And I said, no, it's like a bowl, and there are shallow bits, and then there are deep bits. And he said, no, Ma, there is a deep end of the ocean, but if you go there, you can't ever come back. He was 5. Now he's 25, and he's an actor, and he's decided he's writing a novel, I guess for the job security. And he sent me 30 pages of it, and I said, I'm not going to read this because I want to maintain our relationship. And I'm not the person who can say to you, oh. And then I kept thinking, and I went back and I started to read it. It's really good. It's really good. And so I called him in the middle of the night, like my friend said, Mart, what's the matter? Did one of the kids die? No, this is really good writing. So we'll see what happens there.
How long does it take you to pull a novel together and the title?
How long does it take to pull it together or write it? The whole thing? Research it? Write it? All that?
I think the thought process.
The thought process starts a couple of years before I ever, at least 6 months to 2 years before I ever start writing. The thought process starts about what am I going to write about. And right now, though I'm definitely married to Two If by Sea, I'm having an affair with another idea. And even while I'm doing that, I'm flirting with someone else. So they're out there, and I have another novel finished, which is a classic ghost story based on the Roanoke legend, except not in Virginia. It's moved into a different coastal place that I only have to that I'll complete next week. And it's a story about madness and obsession and boy, you should have heard the titles for that. Oh, The Dark Cliff, The Black Beach, The Fall from the Cliff, 400-year-old dead girl. And so I'm working on finishing that, but I sort of figured out today what the next novel after this will be and what it will be about in a general way. And from now until it's finished will be about 10 months, 9 or 10 months.
My question's kind of along the lines of hers. when you said you had a large family, so when you have the writing process start, are you a secluder? Do you go off to rooms to write? Are you one of these that can sit down with your laptop in the middle of a busy room with children all over and do it?
No,
or
I
do
can do ordinary business. I can do editing, and I can do journalism in the middle of a room with people all over. But I live in a really small house with a really small house because of my financial fall on the ice. We live in a very cursory house with, I live with 8 other people in that house. And so when I'm starting a book or finishing a book, I do have to go away, and I usually go to a writer's, like colony writer's residence, and the one I usually go to is in Illinois, the Ragdale Foundation, because I'm on the board of curators and they can't turn me away. Until I get it started, and then if I come home with 60 pages, then the book has its feet under it, and I can go on from there. But I do have to be secluded. I do have to be alone to think, and to get my head sorted out and spread out all that research that I've done in front of me so that I don't get anything wrong. Because you can say you can say they're stupid or the book is bad, but you can't say that it's incorrect. Because I was a reporter and I always get things right. Yes.
I have a question. It's a compliment to you, but I question, were you always witty? Were you always a storyteller? And I'm thinking is from a school teacher standpoint, like say at your middle school, high school. I'm just curious.
I always was a storyteller, but more importantly, I came from a family. I'm the first person in my family ever to graduate high school. My collar is very blue. And my ma worked at the hardware store and my dad was a plumber. And in that family, we didn't have much money. And so people would sit at the table and play cards, and they would tell stories, and it was an apartment, not a house, so you could kind of creep down the hall, no one could see you, and hide behind the couch and listen to all those things you shouldn't have been hearing. And they would say things like, well, Jim, we always knew he would go bad. And then, when the night he graduated high school, he broke the glass on the tomb of the gypsy queen, and he took her jewelry. And whoa, right away I thought these stories were odd. They weren't just about affairs or things like that. They were about all kinds of mayhem. And now that story actually about what happened to Jim, I made it up, but is in a book called Shadow Show that is a tribute to stories that are a tribute to many well-known writers like Audrey Neffenegger and Stephen King and Joe Hill and Alice Hoffman, David Monteleone. I have written short stories in the tradition of my mentor, who is Ray Bradbury, an amazing writer who died a few years ago at a great age, most generous guy in the world. And it's called Shadow Show, and that was the first scary story I ever wrote. It's called Two of a Kind, and it's about what happens to somebody who does incur that curse. So I was listening to stories all my life in that oral tradition of just Italian people sitting at the table playing cards and telling stories. And my mom was a fierce reader, and she had a house full of books, and I knew where all the ones that I wasn't supposed to read were under the dish towels. All the James Baldwin books were down there. And so one of the most, and I should probably end with this, but one of the most profoundly moving, I just said, my mom didn't even finish high school, and my dad didn't either. But she had a book club, sort of, with the guy across the street, and he had not even finished the 6th grade. He worked for my dad, but they were voracious readers. And one day, they were having a garage sale in the alley in Chicago where I grew up. And I was little, because I could remember that my head was like level with the table. And my mom said to Willie, reader, did you get to the part in the train station yet? And so I knew they were talking about a book, and he said, no, and my mom said, just wait for that, it's stunning. And years went by, and my mom died young, and I realized years and years later, she was talking about Anna Karenina. No one told her that she was too stupid to read that book. And so she just read it, and she thought, what a good story. So, they're for everybody. They're for everybody to gossip about, as long as you don't think that they're a precipice that you can't approach. They're there for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, okay, one more question.
One last question.
I'm not as afraid of the microphone as I thought. I just want to know, is it going to become a movie?
I would love to know that myself. There are 2 film agents who are, running around with it. And I will say that the likelihood of a book becoming a movie, though, this is a very filmic book. And it has a character who's a guy who's 40 years old, who's the main character. And that is in its favor, because nobody wants to make a movie that's about women. It's true. It's a very hateful part of our culture. But so that it has that going for it, and there's all kinds of talk of it, but there are bodies all over the runway. I just would really like someone to option it for a movie and give me the money. And when people say things like, people say things all the time, my author friends say, oh, I hope it isn't made into a movie, because they'll just ruin it. And what they're really saying is, probably no one will make it into a movie, so I want to make it clear that I don't want that to happen, because no one holds a gun to your head and says, if you don't take this $100,000, I'm going to pull the trigger. People voluntarily allow this to happen. And all movies do of books is sell more books. So it's all good. Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much.